The war was ending, but no one had told the cold. By late autumn of 1944, the German Western Front had fractured in ways that no longer made clean lines on a map. Towns changed hands in hours. Units that had existed for years dissolved overnight. Supply chains that had once moved with industrial precision were now broken at a dozen points, and the men and women who depended on them were left to navigate a landscape that no longer had clear rules. The system that had organized their lives, given them ranks, roles, rations, and direction, was coming apart from the inside. And in the wake of that collapse, tens of thousands of people who had been part of that system found themselves moving in the wrong direction, westward, into American hands. The holding compound sat at the edge of a former agricultural depot, a flat stretch of land outside a small Belgian town that had already changed hands twice in the previous months. The buildings were low, long, and built for grain storage, not people. Wooden walls, corrugated iron roofs, ventilation gaps designed to keep grain dry that had never been a problem when sacks of wheat sat beneath them. Now they were. Wind moved through those gaps freely, carrying temperature with it the way water carries salt. You couldn't see it. You could only feel it, slowly, everywhere, until feeling itself began to fade. The women brought there in the first weeks of December arrived in stages. Some had been captured during the chaos following the collapse of a Luftwaffe auxiliary unit near the German border. Others had been attached to a communications depot that simply ceased to exist when its officers fled west without orders or explanation. A handful had been discovered sheltering in a damaged rail station, still wearing their service coats, their papers long since burned or abandoned in the retreat. They ranged in age from teenagers to women in their late 30s. Some had been in uniform for years, others for only a few months. They had different backgrounds, different roles, different reasons for being where they were. What they shared now was the compound, the cold, and the uncertainty of what came next. Processing took time. The U.S. Army had procedures for this: forms, categories, interviews, registration. But procedures moved at the speed of personnel, and personnel were stretched thin across a front that was still moving, still demanding, still consuming resources faster than they could be replaced. The camp operated with a skeleton staff of guards, a single medical orderly who split his time between two compounds, and an interpreter who was only present every third day. In between, orders were relayed through gesture and tone of voice, the universal shorthand of authority across a language barrier. It was imprecise and sometimes frightening, but it was what existed. The women followed instructions carefully. They lined up when told. They moved when pointed. They stayed still when eyes settled on them. They had been warned by older women in the group, those who had heard stories from the Eastern Front, from liberated territories, from rumors passed along retreating columns, that compliance was survival. You did not draw attention. You did not complain. You did not ask for anything you hadn't been given. Asking was weakness. Weakness had consequences. For the first week, that approach held. Then the hands became a problem. It had started gradually, the way cold damage always starts, not with pain, but with its opposite. Numbness that arrived quietly during the night and didn't fully leave by morning. Fingers that felt thick and distant, as if wrapped in cloth that wasn't there. Grip that took longer than it should to form, lagging slightly behind in tension, responding like a mechanism that needed warming before it would operate properly. Women reaching for their ration cans in the morning and finding them heavier than expected, not because of the contents, but because the connection between decision and hand had weakened overnight without anyone noticing it go. The barracks offered little protection against this. The wooden bunks were raised slightly off the ground, which helped with the floor cold, but the gaps in the walls fed a continuous draft that moved across sleeping bodies at ankle height and worked its way upward through the night. Hands, tucked under thin blankets, still lost heat faster than the body could replace it during sleep. By morning, the ritual of waking was accompanied by the slow, careful process of coaxing fingers back into function, flexing them under the blanket before attempting to use them, waiting for the ache that meant circulation was returning. Some of the women had gloves when they arrived. Most did not. Service issue gloves had been among the first things lost in the disorder of retreat, traded for food, left behind on trucks, worn through and discarded weeks earlier when replacements were no longer available. A few had improvised, wrapping strips of spare cloth around their hands at night, tying them loosely enough to allow some movement. It helped marginally, not enough. By the second week, the symptoms had moved past discomfort into something more concerning. Women were dropping things, not dramatically, not in ways that drew immediate attention, but consistently enough that those paying attention would have noticed the pattern. A tin cup fell during morning rations and clattered against the concrete floor, drawing eyes from guards standing nearby. The woman who dropped it looked down at her hand as if it had acted without her permission. She flexed her fingers slowly, one at a time, watching them move with the focused attention of someone relearning something she had always taken for granted. She picked the cup back up carefully, wrapped both hands around it, and said nothing. Others showed different signs of the same problem. One woman, a former telegraph operator who had spent years working with precise, repetitive hand movements as part of her role in a signal unit, could no longer button her coat in the morning without assistance. She stood near the barracks door each day while another woman worked the buttons. For her, both of them treating the process as unremarkable, neither acknowledging what the difficulty represented. A third had developed a livid red patch across the back of her left hand. Tight skin strove her swollen tissue, tender at the edges in a way that worsened each morning, and did not improve during the day. What none of them did was report it. The logic was simple and unspoken among them. They were prisoners. Their discomfort was not a subject for discussion with their captors. Asking for help risked being perceived as manipulative, disruptive, or weak and weakness. In the systems they had come from, was something you concealed rather than announced. Under German military discipline, medical complaints were routed upward through hierarchy and addressed, if at all, according to operational necessity. A woman who could not grip properly was a woman who could not work. That was the frame through which physical problems were considered, not suffering. Utility. They had no reason to believe the American system operated differently. And they had every reason, shaped by years of propaganda and months of war, to assume it operated worse, so they managed quietly. They tucked hands inside sleeves at night and during rest periods. They shared body heat where they could, pressing closer together on the bunks than strict comfort would allow, reasoning that warmth was worth the closeness. They rotated the women with the worst symptoms toward the center of the sleeping area, where heat from other bodies accumulated slightly and the draft from the walls reached last. They helped each other with tasks that required fine motor control, quietly, without drawing attention to why the help was needed. It was a young American corporal who first noticed something was wrong. He was not a medic. He was an infantryman from rural Indiana who had been reassigned to compound guard duty while his unit's combat casualties were processed. Replacements waited to be integrated. He was 20 years old. He had been in Europe for 4 months, long enough to have seen enough, and not long enough to have stopped seeing it clearly. He did not speak German beyond the half dozen commands he had been given in an orientation session that lasted one afternoon. But he had grown up working with his hands in cold weather, on farms where winter mornings started before the light came, and where the line between manageable cold and dangerous cold was something you learned to read in other people's behavior before you saw it in their skin. He was watching a group of women collect their morning rations when he saw it. Not a dropped cup, not a wince or a grimace, just the way hands moved. Carefully, deliberately. With the compensating precision of people who had learned not to trust their grip and were working around that knowledge without acknowledging it. He watched for a few minutes longer than his usual attention to the compound required. Then he went to find the medical orderly. The orderly was a slight, methodical man from Massachusetts who had trained as a general duty medic before. The Army assigned him to processing camp support, where the work was less dramatic, but no less constant. He listened to the corporal's description without interrupting. Then he frowned, set down what he was doing, and came to the barracks that afternoon. He walked slowly along the line of women, observing without touching. He asked the interpreter, who had arrived that morning for his rotation, to explain that he wanted to look at their hands, not to punish, not to document in any punitive sense. To look. There was hesitation, real hesitation, of the kind that comes not from stubbornness, but from risk calculation. Showing a problem to authority was an act with consequences in the world they had come from. Even the act of being seen as someone with a problem carried weight. The interpreter repeated the request and added something in a quieter tone. The women looked at each other. One extended her hands first. She was perhaps 22, with dark circles under her eyes that had been there since before capture, and the posture of someone who had stopped anticipating good outcomes some time ago. Her knuckles were pale and swollen. The skin on two fingers had turned red at the edges, and was beginning at the tip of one to show the tightening that comes before blistering. The medic looked closely, without urgency, without alarm. He asked her permission, through the interpreter, before he touched anything. She nodded. He pressed lightly along her fingers, watching her face for the wince that came with pressure, noting where it arrived and where it did not. He asked, through the interpreter, how long her hands had felt this way. She said 2 weeks, maybe more. He nodded. He moved to the next woman. By the end of the examination, he had identified 11 women with varying degrees of cold injury. 3 had early-stage frostbite, tissue damage that had not yet reached the irreversible threshold but was approaching it. 4 had chilblains, a painful inflammatory response to repeated cold exposure that would worsen with each subsequent night if the exposure continued. The remaining 4 had circulation compromise that hadn't yet produced visible damage, but showed in the color and temperature of the skin and in the way the fingers responded to pressure. Without intervention, the medic estimated several of these women would sustain permanent reduction in hand function within days. He came back the following morning with a written report and a short, specific list of requirements. The camp officer read it. He was not a sentimental man. He had run processing operations through 2 campaigns and had long since stopped being moved by the general category of prisoner suffering. But the report was medical and specific, and it referenced outcomes that were both preventable and documentable. The Geneva Convention was not an abstraction to him. It was accountability. It was the kind of outcome that generated the kind of documentation that followed a career in directions you did not want it to go. He approved the requirements without ceremony. What arrived over the following 2 days was not remarkable in itself. Wool liners pulled from a supply depot that had overordered winter kit for a unit that had since moved east and never collected its full allocation. Cotton strips cut from surplus cloth and rolled into wrapping lengths. A small metal basin designated for the morning warming Soak the Medic had specified as essential for restoring circulation gradually rather than aggressively, which could itself cause tissue damage in already compromised hands. 2 additional wool blankets per sleeping space, issued quietly during an afternoon distribution, that was noted in the supply log as a standard cold weather supplemental issue. There was no announcement, no explanation given to the women before the supplies arrived. When the interpreter finally explained what had been observed, what had been reported, and what was being done about it, several of the women said nothing for a long moment. One asked carefully whether this was a precursor to something else, whether the medical attention meant they were being assessed for work assignments, or separated from the group, or prepared for some kind of transfer. The interpreter relayed the question. The medic shook his head. It meant none of those things. It was treatment. Only treatment. The wool liners were handed out that afternoon. They were not gloves in any proper sense, being shapeless and thick in ways that made precise movement difficult. Some women had to fold the wrist sections back twice to achieve a workable fit, but they were warm in the way that wool is warm, holding heat even when damp, resisting the slow, cold drain that had been working through the compound walls for weeks. The difference was immediate enough to register in faces. The particular tightness around eyes and jaw that comes from chronic, low-level, unacknowledged pain began to ease. Not for everyone at once. Not completely, but visibly, in the way that relief is visible even when the person feeling it is trying not to show it. The morning soak was a stranger experience. Sitting in a row with hands submerged in warm water felt, to several of the women, deeply incongruous with everything else about where they were. One woman said afterward that it reminded her of washing dishes at her mother's house, the specific sensation of warm water moving around fingers that had been cold, and how strange it was that her body could produce the same feeling of comfort in a place like this. Another sat rigidly at first, as if softening in any direction was unsafe, then gradually let her shoulders drop as the warmth worked upward through her hands and into her wrists and forearms. The three women with more advanced frostbite were treated separately, in the small room the medic used for examinations. The process was careful and unhurried, controlled rewarming, documentation, close observation for the complications that could accompany the return of blood flow to damaged tissue. When one of the women flinched during the process and apologized reflexively, quickly, as if the sound itself had been a violation of some rule, the medic shook his head. Through the interpreter, he told her she did not need to be quiet. That sounds were allowed. She stayed quiet anyway. The habit ran deeper than a single reassurance could reach. But the apology did not come again. Over the following week, the compound shifted in small ways. Hands that had been perpetually tucked and protected began to move more freely during the day. Women who had been performing simple tasks with the concentrated effort of someone working at the edge of their capability found those tasks become ordinary again, buttoning, holding, folding, writing for those who had been given paper during registration. Grip returned not as a sudden restoration, but as a gradual reacquaintance, each morning slightly better than the one before. The guards noticed the change in the same way they had noticed the original problem, not as a named thing, but as an atmospheric shift. The compound felt less like something under pressure. Morning rations moved faster, lines held steadier. The particular quality of silence that comes from a group of people managing pain and concealing it began to lift, replaced by something quieter but less tense. None of the Americans who had been involved spoke of it later in any formal sense. The medic filed his reports and moved on to the next set of problems that a camp of that size produced continuously. The corporal from Indiana returned to his post rotation. The officer filed his supply approvals and did not revisit the matter. The war outside the wire continued its final brutal months, indifferent to everything that had happened inside. But the women remembered. Not because it was an extraordinary event by any measure that history uses. There were no speeches, no gestures meant to be witnessed and recorded. Nothing that would appear in a dispatch or a citation. It was a problem noticed, reported, assessed, and addressed through the application of available resources. That was all. But that was everything. They had arrived conditioned to believe that their discomfort was irrelevant to their captors, that their bodies in captivity were facts to be managed rather than conditions to be improved. They had not complained because they had learned, through years of a system that operated on fear and utility, that complaint was risk. And then someone had noticed without being told, had acted without being asked, had treated their hands not as the hands of prisoners, but as the hands of people whose continued function mattered for its own sake. Years later, in letters and in fragments of memory gathered by researchers collecting accounts from women who had passed through Allied, holding facilities in that final winter of the war, the same details recurred with a consistency that spoke to how deeply the experience had lodged. Itself, the tin basin, the warm water, the wool that smelled of supply depots and canvas rather than smoke. The morning when fingers that had stopped being fully reliable became reliable again. It was not remembered as mercy in any dramatic sense. It was remembered as something quieter and in some ways more unsettling to reconcile, the simple fact of being noticed. The fact that someone had looked at their hands and seen a problem worth solving. Not for any reason the propaganda had prepared them to expect from an enemy. Just because the problem was there and it could be addressed, and so it was. In the long scale of that war, this moment registers as nothing. No outcome shifted because of a tin basin and a set of wool liners distributed in a Belgian depot compound in December 1944. No battle was altered. No line moved. But for the women who held their hands in warm water that morning and felt sensation return to fingers they had been quietly grieving, something else shifted. The war did not end in that moment. It did not become less real or less terrible. But the world it was happening in became, by some small and irreducible measure, less predictable in its cruelty, and sometimes, in a world built almost entirely on certainty about what people will do to each other, that unpredictability is the most important thing of all. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing so these moments aren't lost to time. Like the video to help it reach more people, and leave a comment below with where you're watching from. These overlooked pieces of history deserve to be remembered.